do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion, can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but can you think of a better one?
Hello and welcome to episode 19 of Murdocracy, a podcast that keeps an eye on the news and influence of News Corp, the most influential media company in the Western world. I'm Cam Wilson.
And I am Sami Shah.
Hey, Sammy, I've got a quite a personal question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any bad news that you need to get out ahead of before someone else breaks the story? You know, is there a video of you and maybe a certain amphetamine that you want to preempt and get to me before, I don't know, someone publishes an article on it?
I mean, look, there's my dalliance with black tar heroin was quite extensive. I took a lot of selfies of doing black tar heroin while working for ISIS. So I don't know if that could be a problem, but
Right.
You know, I feel like that's political correctness gone mad.
Exactly. Ugh, cancel culture has
Right?
really
Run amok.
it has made it hard for us these days.
Well,
If you-
man can't do black tar heroin with the Taliban, then what exactly is the point?
Exactly. Well, I mean, look, at least it sounds like it's locally sourced. You understand the full,
Ethically, though?
farm. I was going to say farm to table, farm to pipe, I guess.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
If you don't know what we're talking about, we'll cover it later on. But there has been a story that involves a certain Australian executive and also some footage of them using methamphetamine that and the saga takes an even weirder media turn, and we'll get into that in a
So
second.
strange.
It's weird. But Sammy, actually, how are you?
I am doing well, other than the black tar heroin that I'm trying to kick. I'm getting by. Yeah, it's a interesting time to be paying attention to Australian politics because clearly, even though an election date hasn't been announced, we're already in cuckoo land. So, I'm already exhausted.
rancid?
I'm so tired already. How is it exhausting and we haven't even begun yet?
Well, I mean, wasn't there I think it might have been like a book in politics that I haven't read, but I see referred to all the time, which is the idea of the never-ending campaign, which is that, you know, these days that considering the news cycle and internal polling and the machinations, these parties are like, you know, modern political parties and the apparatus just decide, well, we're never not going to be focusing on trying to get reelected because that's, you know, that is increasingly the only reason we exist, particularly with this government, which, you know, regardless of whatever your political sway is, you would agree hasn't been the most like ideologically driven, you know, policy driven government. For them, it does seem like the main objective that they have is just to be reelected to do what? Not entirely clear, but like, you know, they'll figure that out once they get back in.
Well, I mean, that's largely it. It's power for power's sake sometimes. And the thing that's exhausting is, you're right. One of the critiques you've always had of America is, you know, they do a 4-year election campaign is basically what every government is. And in Australia, we've only had 3 months of election campaigning, which is allowed. And so it's been refreshing. We're seeing less and less of that, clearly. Much less of that now.
I think that is dead. Now, Sammy, later on, we'll be chatting to the Guardian's media correspondent, Amanda Meade. She was the one who broke the story, I think it was last week, about the News Corp Academy that had decided to be BFFs with the University Business School and not their university center. We'll be talking to her about, well, one, like, tell us about that story. Let's get behind it. But also, she worked at News Corp. She's seen it change over the years.
Yes.
Hearing what she has to say about how it's changing, and in particular, you know, what we can then now expect in the coming election. I can't wait for that. But other than that, the only newskeeping we have is, as always, you know, please, if you like what we do, subscribe to our Patreon. It's patreon.com/Murdocracy. All right, let's get into the news. Well, last week we spoke about the Australian's investigation editor, Sharri Markson, and her scoop about a comment that Anthony Albanese made 31 years ago.
What a scoop.
Yeah,
Just
I know.
Great investigative journalism right there.
Piping hot. Well, I mean, like, to get there, I mean, she must have done a bit of investigating. It was 3 decades ago.
That's true. I don't know. If does Google archive stuff that old?
Oh, God, I don't know. You'd probably have to go to a library and read.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Did she have to use microfiche, you think?
I don't know what that is, and I'm just going to keep on moving on.
You're so damn young, scam.
Well, she's come out with another scoop this week. It is that Chinese propaganda outlet endorses Anthony Albanese as better PM than Scott Morrison. And in it, she writes, the government-owned media outlet which published this scoop, which commonly espouses the views of the Chinese Communist Party, is promoting an article praising Mr. Albanese as a safe leader, saying he positively shines compared to Morrison. Not until much later does she actually note that the author is not like, someone from the editorial team. It's not a Chinese government employee, but it's actually a former Australian diplomat, Bruce Haig. So that was one thing that came out. Then later on news.com.au, which is Australia's most visited commercial website, News Corp website, Sam Maiden, who we've spoken positively on in the past, wrote a piece that was a video has emerged of Anthony Albanese speaking Mandarin and urging closer ties between Australia and China just 24 hours after a brutal sledge from the Prime Minister. Yes, this comes after the government's continued campaign. At one point, Scott Morrison said it and withdrew a comment accusing one of the Labor frontbenchers of being a Manchurian candidate. He's called them the party that, it's called Labor, the party that the CCP would like to see come in. In this, article Sam Maiden wrote, which got a lot of attention, said a transcript of an event that happened a few years ago of Anthony Albanese going to a Chinese business event and then speaking briefly in Mandarin. The transcript of the event on his official website has removed the statement he made while speaking in Mandarin, which is recorded in a video of that the organization posted on YouTube. Mm-hmm. I looked into it because I was like, they're saying, that a transcript had been removed.
Right. Yeah.
But I looked into an archive version of the website, and as far as I can tell, Albo's website has never had the transcript on there. So the point of the story is that Albo had spoken a sentence in Mandarin and had just said we should be closer with China, who, by the way, is our biggest trading partner, and particularly back in 2018 when things were, not quite in the similar like they are now.
Yeah.
That was a pretty common attitude. Sammy, what is going on here? Is this all as blatant as it seems? Are they banging the drums of national security to help out the government?
It's what it is. It's that thing which always disappoints me is every election I see the way an organization like News Corp will really very blatantly attack one political party and pump up the other political party. And a part of me goes, how can they be this blatant? It's ridiculous. Everyone can see through it. But they do it because it obviously works. So there is an element where it's like the blatantness of it is because there's no downside to them in being this blatant. I mean, there's stuff you can find in 2018, which is when they're blaming Albanese of giving that speech. If you go to the 2018 version or at least look back in 2018 on the Global Times, which is the Chinese government's, the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda outlet, the Global Times, there's an article there praising Scott Morrison as the right leader for Australia, saying he has reason and judgment, and he's got a deep understanding and unambiguous perception and Confucian wisdom. So if you want to go through the past, then at one point the Chinese government clearly thought Scott Morrison was the best prime minister for Australia because it benefited them as well. It's that thing of what reminds me of, and this is very I'm going to sound like I'm exaggerating, but I feel like there's some truth here.
Okay.
At the height of the war on terror, when there were moments in which you had anyone who spoke Arabic or anyone who had an affiliation with the Middle East and those things, all of a sudden that was seen as a negative. All of a sudden that was seen as, look at you, you've got ISIS affiliations or Taliban affiliations. In America, you saw it with Hillary Clinton's advisor suddenly being claimed to be a undercover worker for the Egyptian Brotherhood because she had an Egyptian background. So you see that. And this China baiting thing is similar. It's very xenophobic, if you will.
Yeah, look, I have actually a lot of respect for Sam Maiden as a journalist. She's done great stuff. And it's almost like my brain's wheels are spinning and trying to understand why this article was written for any other reason other than the fact that it's just it really does seem like it's just furthering the government's agenda. And I'm not saying that Sam Maiden or anyone from News Corp is necessarily has been directed to do this.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if this is something and this is just purely hypothetical, but I should put it out there that, like, like when a political journalist wants to get access and work with people, often they'll kind of, cover something as a way of cultivating a source. Maybe that's it. Maybe that this was just, maybe this was just a story that someone that, potentially like a liberal source dropped in her inbox, and she said, I don't have anything else to talk about today, and I think it'll get attention. I don't really know, but I think, speculating about that to some extent is a bit of a fool's game, because, like,
there's no way of confirming it.
There's no way of knowing, but I think the effect is like, this just does seem like xenophobia, because there is no reason why you would write this. This is a very normal thing to do, to say we should be close with China, to speak Mandarin. I mean, look, we had a prime minister who's been on this podcast who spoke a lot of Mandarin. And I mean, I'm almost a bit of a loss for words.
There's an element of this which is very old school politics, which I'm very disappointed in Labour for falling into that trap again. And it happens every election, which is federal government or Liberal Party makes a wild and batshit crazy accusation, and Labour expends all their energy debunking it and refuting it, as opposed to talking about policies and talking about their own, like the story now isn't, Labour's whatever ideas Labour might have in the upcoming election. It's whether or not we've got a Anthony Albanese who's a Manchurian candidate, quote unquote, because he once said a sentence in Chinese. Like, so that's
I
where the problem lies.
Yeah, I mean, I saw people saying, well, now we're talking about national security stuff, and like, I don't think anyone's going to change their votes because Scott Morrison called Richard Marles a Manchurian candidate, but the fact that he did. And got the attention there.
Do young people even know what that movie is? Did you have to, like I know what it is, but did you have to look it up?
No, I knew what it is, because it's like, I guess, a popular saying that's come out of the movie. But like, I haven't seen the movie, couldn't tell you who's in it.
Have you seen? Okay, so the classic original had Frank Sinatra, which is pretty cool. But the remake, which was done in 2006 or 2007, I think, has got Denzel Washington. And what's funny in that is they don't have the Manchurian candidate in that isn't being controlled by China or the Soviet government, because now we have good relationships, or Hollywood has good relationships with China. It's being controlled by a corporation called the Manchurian Corporation Initiative or something, which is a private equity firm investing in nanotechnology. It's a complete batshit movie.
And do you know why the other reason would be that way is because, like around that time, Western filmmakers were like, damn, we could really like make a lot more money if we sold our films and showed our film properly in China. And so they're like, so we'll go from like, I mean, at this point, they've probably, they've used people from the Middle East too much. That's kind of getting a bit old, a bit dated. And like, well, we can't do China because we want to show the film over there. So we'll take it out in big business and they'll be okay, because they're counting, they're laughing all the way to the bank.
It is very bizarre. There's another element to the story which I find really fascinating, which is always, whenever a politician accuses someone of something, you don't have to look very far into the politician's own past to find them doing the exact same thing. So when the Liberal Party accuses the Labour Party of being in bed with China or good for China, etc., it didn't take very long for Crikey to find a news story, which is that basically at one point in the past, in the very recent past, under the Tony Abbott government, the coalition and News Corp were collaborating with China.
Yeah, it is. They say like it's projection, right? Like there's a lot of people, when you're calling out something, you look back and they've done it themselves. Yeah, look, I find it very hard to understand why this was done. And like, here's the thing, just my final point on like, in particular, the Sam Maiden article. I mean, clearly the like, there's some kind of implication that the fact that Albo was speaking Mandarin, there's something we don't understand, and he hasn't translated it, so it's some kind of mystery. Well, if this is such a mystery, if there is some idea that he's being underhanded, or maybe he's speaking because he's speaking in Mandarin, he's saying something different to what he's saying in English, so we should understand. Why didn't they translate it? Like,
Google Translate exists.
Yeah, exactly. Or just like, I'm sure there's a bunch of people at news.com.au who can speak Mandarin. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And so that's why I'm just like, is this really what we're going to go into? If we're going to go into, this long election campaign, and we're not officially in it, but it's happening now, and it's going until May, where we're going to make it about just like scaring people about the influence of China and, the unfortunate and like awful consequences that there will be for people who take that kind of messaging in, take that fear, and then potentially put Asian Australians at risk because of it. Because like that's what we see happen when these things happen. Like the kind of racism that comes out of it, out of the whole cultural
Yes.
sense of fear, actually does end up hurting people.
And that's what, one of the things that Asian Australians have copped a lot in the last few years because the COVID stuff and the China relationship with COVID and everything. And they've just kind of hopefully been coming out of that abuse that's been directed at them. And now this. I can't imagine how frustrating that must be.
Yes, well, let's hope there's not too much of it, but I think we might be disappointed. Now, just then, we spoke about Sherry Markson, who has come up a little bit, hasn't she? Well, I have something else that she was actually involved in this week, which I found very interesting. So this week, she had another story, a bombshell, that the former founder of Grilled had resigned from a new ASX-listed company after a video of him smoking meth, among other things, had emerged. I mean, it's a pretty big scoop, right? But Markson was actually beaten to the punch in a piece from Nine Papers' Chip Legrand, who claims that the former Grilled CEO was actually the subject of like a years-long extortion racket. Legrand wrote, on Tuesday morning when he was contacted by Sherry Markson, he being the former CEO, a journalist with the Australian newspaper had given him a deadline to comment on one of the videos. The Grilled CEO knew that extortionists had made good on their threats. This was kind of, essentially, they were making the case that Sherry had somehow sourced this video, this awful video from extortionists and people trying to make money out of it. In a follow-up piece, Markson kind of fired back and wrote that Bainbridge, the Grilled CEO, seems to be implying that the Australian has played some role in the extortion attempt. This is beyond belief. We were investigating the story over 5 weeks and intended to publish whether or not he paid money to his so-called extortionist. Now, I think it's very hard for us to know what the truth here is, but I'm really curious, Sammy, kind of more broadly, how often do you personally think about where a story comes from, where the information is sourced from? And in a way, like, obviously this has impacts on people's lives, but as a consumer reading the news, does it actually matter how a journalist obtained the facts?
I think as a consumer reading the news, it doesn't, because you assume a certain level of responsibility in the journalistic process before it gets to you. And I think that's where this story is problematic, because when you have a source, even if it is a unnamed source, you need to verify information in a certain way and everything. And if there is an aspect of the story that is linked to extortion, which again we cannot confirm, it is Bainbridge's word against Markson's word, but if there is an extortion element to the story, which Chip Legrand has written about, then why is News Corp publishing a story that feeds into the extortion thing? I don't think, and I've read Bainbridge's criticism, or at least his statement about this. He doesn't seem to be saying at all that News Corp is part of the extortion. He's saying, why is News Corp playing into the extortionist's hands by using blackmail material in this way and making it public, so because he doesn't pay up? And that's where the story is. So I think Markson's being a bit defensive on something where I would argue that duty of care has not been done in a responsible way, and there's a legal aspect to this which I think is very problematic as well. Is there news value to the former CEO of Grill, or former founder of Grill, not CEO, sorry, and member of a new ASX-listed company being caught smoking crack and on pictures? I saw the story I would care about, but I'm not sure others wouldn't.
Yeah, I find this weird, and I don't know if this is, having been a journalist now like 5 years has eroded my brain and gotten rid of me being just a human empathetic person, at least in regards of whether information should come out. But I saw a story like this and I'm like, well, I don't know if I personally would publish it, but the idea that someone would get it and not publish something like this, I don't it seems like it. I guess it just seemed newsworthy. We see this kind of stuff, relatively regularly, particularly in tabloid stuff overseas. The kind of broader question, though, about where information comes from and how that affects, whether someone should publish, I think is very interesting. And I'll point you back to something in the 2016 US election. there were all these things that came out that were awful about Hillary Clinton, and that's because her email was hacked.
Yes.
We know like and released by WikiLeaks, and that's a whole story in itself. And there was this big kind of like media debrief afterwards, and I think this largely happened because people didn't expect Donald Trump to win, and then when he just did, they were like, "Well, did we do something wrong?" And part of the thing was that people were saying, "Well, you've got this kind of asymmetry where you've got like one person's emails, like one of these political like candidates, their emails have been hacked, and so that means we had all of this kind of dirt coming out, just like
Yes.
things that were just not even like necessarily like scandals, but just like picking apart emails, anything that an internal organization sent to each other
were hacked.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly. But like, I mean, to some extent, like, unfortunately, that is kind of the way that the world works.
Yes.
Like, if I'm a journalist, like, I had a story that was about that a organization had pitched to Labor to pay for people to do negative TikToks about Scott Morrison. And they had offered people, including accidentally myself, the money to do so.
Yes.
And that came out, and that was something that I think like probably, I mean, it did, I think, unfortunately have a negative effect on Labor, because it's kind of people like, oh, they're doing this, even though they hadn't necessarily agreed to do anything, as far as my reporting showed. But so I got that, that was a little scoop that maybe was not super great for Labor. That doesn't mean that like I then have to spend all my time making sure there's the equally negative one for the
Right,
Liberal
exactly.
Party or something.
Not at
And
all.
and although I may end up, for one way or another, I may end up, just focusing on one side purely out of luck, purely because I get like, more dirt on one side. I don't know, like, balance, I don't think comes necessarily from, having to make sure you do like one good thing and one bad thing and all that kind of stuff. It comes in each individual piece. I was saying, like, bringing it like all back to this, like, I think maybe more than other people, I'm more like agnostic about where information comes from. I should think about how a source is trying to use me, but like that's purely to be like, well, am I getting played here somehow? Does that affect the information? But if I just have this information, a scoop, no matter where it comes from, like, very often we know like whistleblowers for some reason are aggrieved. That doesn't actually affect the information that they've given you. And I think that like, I think a lot of people actually kind of came out being like, well, like assuming that Shari had been, working directly with the extortionists or whatever. We don't really know, but I do think if you decide it's newsworthy, even if it's bad for the people, even if there are extortionists somehow involved in this, I kind of think that it was like, it was the right thing to put it out there. Am I wrong?
Well, okay, so I was thinking a lot about Duncan Storer recently. Do you remember Duncan Storer?
No, I don't.
So a few years ago, there was a man on Q&A, and he asked a question on an episode of Q&A, which basically was, let me just find the exact question that he'd asked. He's a private individual who happened to be on an episode of Q&A, asked a question of some of the politicians, and that question then got him, drew the ire of the Herald Sun. And the Herald Sun then went it up and did like a 2-day expose into this man's life and how he was a bad person in the past and how he'd done drugs and things like that, and really kind of destroyed this person's life through the expose they done. It was a very similar thing to what had happened to Trolley Man, which was a man who tried to stop a terrorist attack in the Melbourne CBD by ramming his trolley into the attacker. Was heralded as a hero for it, and then a lot of newspapers looked into his past, found out he had a terrible past because he was a bad person in the past in terms of breaking and entering and things, and destroyed his life as a result. And I've always had a question about the ethics of investigative journalism and expose around private individuals and versus public ones. I'm not saying that Bainbridge, who is the former founder of Grilled, etc., is a fully recognizable private individual. Given his wealth and status, he might be, but at the same time, I feel like, is there an ethical value, a news value to a man smokes crack?
Yeah, and we should say that in the initial piece which Shari Markson wrote, she had a comment from someone who was saying that, if someone's doing drugs like this, it can be erratic and affect their behavior. So she had clearly at least made some effort to say, well, here's the news value beyond just like see this and judge for yourself. It was, we think this could affect his ASX listed company, which I think is interesting. Yeah, look, it is always difficult to decide whether to publish something or not. But in this regard, I do think it is interesting, at least, to try and consider where things come from that might affect how you interpret a story. But ultimately, you have to judge it based on, well, is this story actually important or not?
Yeah.
And then
Fair enough. I mean, otherwise you've got a situation where they don't publish what's it called, the Watergate story because they don't like who Deep Throat is, as and then we miss out on a great story anyway.
Yeah, exactly. A great story, got a good film out of it too. I loved it. So News Corp and its fellow media organization ABC serve a very important role in keeping the regions informed. But one regional news org says they're also making it harder to do their job. As part of a parliamentary inquiry into Australia's regional newspapers, McPherson Media Group Executive Chairman Ross McPherson, who oversees mastheads like the Shepparton News and the Yarrawonga Chronicle, independent publications like that, said that one of the major problems they have is these big news orgs poaching their talent. The ABC's announcement in early December of 50 new places for regional journalists filled us with some alarm, he said, because like News Corp, the ABC doesn't train its own regional journalists. It poaches them. I find this very interesting. I never thought about this, Sami. What's your kind of take on this?
Well, I mean, they're not wrong. I mean, whenever you think about the regional journalism and how we talk about it in Australia, one of the big things that's always comes up from ABC staff, from people who like ABC content, is it's a shame that the regional newspapers are being cut down, that there's less of them, because so many of those people end up becoming great ABC journalists. And it's true, some of the best ABC regional journalism comes from people who cut their teeth on local small newspapers. And I never once really considered the loss to those local small newspapers. It's a very interesting thing. If you head down to Shepparton, for example, there's offices in Shepparton. ABC has an office in Shepparton, and Channel 9, Channel 10, everyone has their offices in Shepparton. And if you're writing for the local Shepparton news, I don't doubt that you would definitely want to, jump up to the big leagues when that opportunity comes. But that's also part and parcel of the world we live in. Everyone starts local and then aspires to national in many industries. So I never thought about the fact that these small newspapers suffer a loss as well. But that is also part of the problem of the world we live in, is that, regional things always end up being subsumed by national things. And I say it's a tragedy, but it is the way of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in a regional ABC office. I saw us take people from, small regional papers. And by take, I should also say, this was employees who chose to move because ABC jobs in regional places were still sought after. And even for people who didn't want to eventually move to the city, as many did, people would say, because I was in Geraldton and there was an ABC there. So for someone who had gone to the regions to get any journalism job, it was also one of their ways of getting back to the city, because they would be like, well, if I go to ABC Geraldton and then I can hopefully transfer to ABC Perth. It actually ends up being quite difficult, but that's the kind of plan. And I mean, look, to put it really bluntly, a lot of regional independent newspapers pay their staff quite poorly, and often if you read, for instance, News
because
Corp,
their budgets are small, and that's what it is.
Exactly, and that's because people don't, I mean, in part that is because they are competing with someone like the ABC, but also because people aren't advertising as much with them anymore. And you often hear in places like News Corp that ABC journalists are very well paid, but the truth is that an ABC journalist would be better paid than most independent journalists in somewhere in the regions. But then if you go to the cities, a lot of ABC journalists, particularly as you go beyond the very entry level, would be much more poorly paid than
absolutely
their commercial counterpart. So that's kind of where it all fits in there. For people who want to join the ABC, it's often better work conditions. Your message, your content goes further. You get seen by more people, and
a pittance, basically. Yes.
Yeah. So look, I understand it. I don't really think you can do kind of anything about that. But I mean, I guess that's just kind of the way it is.
Unless you get rid of the entire capitalistic enterprise that is modern world, yes.
Yeah, and I think that might be just a little bit beyond the parliamentary inquiry into Australia's regional newspapers. And finally, Sami, I've got a TV show that I reckon you might be interested in. It's a new documentary series by the CNN called The Murdoch's Empire of Influence. And it'll be out during autumn Australian time and is set to be a behind-the-scenes look at the rise of the media tycoon, his influence all over the globe, and the intense succession battle, I can hear you like,
yes,
between his children over who would inherit control of his media empire, according to a statement released by the network. Sami, is this a must-watch for you, or have you got already enough of this hosting a Murdoch podcast and living in Australia?
Well, obviously, it's a topic I'm interested in. That's why I'm doing this podcast. And I just want to tell anyone who does want to know about the rise of the media tycoon. We did 2 episodes about the origins of News Corp that I still, worth listening to. I worked really hard on them. I'm quite proud of them. But overall, hell's yeah. The only thing, it's a CNN documentary. And sometimes this American, particularly the CNN documentaries, really great. The production style is overblown and overdramatic. And there's a lot of grungy fonts being used and it annoys me. So I'll give it a try. I don't have high expectations.
I'm definitely and I'd love to see it. I can't
all right,
really
fair
get
enough
of it. And hey, look, since we were probably one of the inspirations for it, I'm sure the show's producers have stumbled across this podcast. We'll probably get like a check in the mail, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm already buying a new house purely based on the anticipated money that will come my way.
Don't hold out on us. So recently, News Corp announced that they were doing a partnership with Google to launch their own News Corp Digital News Academy with the University of Melbourne. I mean, already people kind of had some thoughts about that, but then it soon came out that there was actually a backlash against it from the university because it had not been launched with their Centre of Advancing Journalism, but in fact in their business school. Amanda Meade is the Guardian's media correspondent. She's worked all across the industry at Fairfax while it was still Fairfax, and of course at News at The Australian. She was the one who broke the story and joins us now. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Cam.
Good to have you here. Now, maybe straight off the bat, Amanda, put yourself in the shoes of maybe just a fresh school graduate, knowing what you know about this news academy and you wanted to become a journalist, is this somewhere that you would sign up for?
Well, funny you should say that, because when I spoke to Campbell Reid about it, and he's going to be the first head, his first line to me was, well, Amanda, if you still worked for us, you could do this course. And I was like, okay, because Campbell, I know him pretty well. He was actually my editor at The Australian. Look, he made it sound like a very hands-on kind of technical TAFE type course rather than journalism education. And I guess it did sound useful, but yeah, look, I still have my reservations. I'm not saying I wouldn't do it if I was there. I think it would be interesting, but...
So there's one thing that comes up in the article, Amanda, which is that, I can't remember who it was, but someone from the university alludes to a long-standing animosity by News Corp towards academia. Do you think that's right? And do you think that's kind of what is partially shaping the form that this academy has taken?
Yeah, that was Andrew Dodd, who's the head of the centre. And actually, Andrew and I worked together at The Australian on the media section. So it's all one big family. But he was quite strong in his comments, and he said that News Corp has deliberately avoided working within the journalism school because of their long-held animosity towards journalism courses. I have to agree that they have, and I mean, I witnessed this firsthand, the way they targeted various academics. They papped Margaret Simons, for example, I remember, and put a photo of her on the front page. They did several stories about Julie Passetti, another academic. They've done quite a few hit jobs, classic Oz hit jobs on academics, and there is a myth inside News Corp that the university journalism courses are just a hotbed of lefties hating journalism, hating News Corp. It's not really like that.
What's kind of interesting is that there's been a long-standing relationship between News Corp and Google and the tech giants generally, but it hasn't always been a positive one. If anything, I remember for a long time it was outright, you will pay us and you're stealing from us. And now, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, we've really seen that change as money has changed hands, mostly going from the tech giants to News Corp. What do you think that this very cozy relationship where you've got them actually both working together to set up, as they say, this, next generation of journalists who are commercially focused, putting out something that's commercially viable. What do you think that says about, their relationship and the way that kind of journalism is headed?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are so many layers to this story. And the turnaround of News Corp seeing Google not as someone who's, cutting their grass, undermining their business model, evil tech giants that need to pay us for everything they're stealing, to actually allowing them to fund and shape, their course. It's extraordinary, and they're working really close with them now because they're giving them millions and millions of dollars, and it suits them to be friends. But I mean, you've got to worry about how much input Google is going to have into shaping this curriculum if they're paying for it. And is it really journalism when you're teaching journalists how to write stories that are going to come up well in a Google search? Is that really journalism?
Yeah, it is interesting. And, I just think about all the time about how certain aspects of the internet have just drastically changed what journalism is. I mean, the one thing you kind of mentioned then is search engine optimization, which is now, key for any kind of like media outlets. But people who are listening may not actually realize to the extent to which it actually changes the form. So like an example is you'll almost see now every online digital headline that's about a person or a thing or a noun or essentially what someone would search to find out about it. That will always be the first word in a headline. I know that's a small thing, but that means you'll often see it would be if it was about me, my obituary be Cam Wilson, comma, journalist, comma, dies at 31. It's just a little thing, but it permeates throughout the whole, the whole craft of journalism. And I guess maybe bring it back into to take this away from me, just pontificating about it. But I mean, this is kind of where we're seeing this clash, and this is broader than digital media, but obviously is a huge part of it. But the clash between the idea of journalism as an academic study and journalism as a trade, as something that people are doing. Well, I mean, often you'll see people being oh, I don't even need to go to university. I just learn everything I know on the job. I think, Sammy and I spoke about last week about how universities are changing and adapting to that. Have you got any strong thoughts on this kind of how we're seeing the I guess the interaction between these two schools of thought and how that's affecting Australian media?
Yeah. Well, in terms of journalism courses, I mean, I did my journalism study as a postgraduate at UTS, more than 30 years ago. And it was, even back then, very practical. It taught me how to write news stories, helped me get them published, and then got me a cadetship at the Herald. So it was, even back then, I don't even think they've changed that much. They were very focused at UTS anyway in getting students into jobs. But I don't think you need a journalism degree or any degree really to be a journalist. People have come into it from, many different backgrounds, and to a certain extent it is a craft, rather than something that has to be studied academically. But I certainly think it helps to have either done a different job before or to have been to university, just so you can, as I think Andrew Dodd talked about, put things into context when you're doing journalism. Put them in a social and political context.
Yeah, exactly. And since you mentioned, your initial training, can you tell us a bit about how you've been through the industry and including your time working at News?
Look, I had an incredible 18 years at the Australian. I started there in 1994, and then I left in 2012. Does that sound right? Yeah. The numbers. And mostly was very happy and worked with really great people and, did serious journalism. And obviously, look, things have changed. It's almost 10 years now since I left. And I think things have gone downhill in terms of the Australian being independent, practicing really independent journalism. Obviously, a lot of their stories now are, they're hit jobs, they're biased, they're, pursuing a certain agenda. It wasn't always like that. I mean, they used to have like a proper media section, a lift-out media section, which had 10 dedicated journalists and 2 editors, just producing, really good features about media. But I noticed it started to change in about 2007. And in the last few years I was there, they just became a lot more focused on sort of attacking the opposition media companies. And I just found it more and more difficult to sort of dodge the bullets, to be... I never had to actually write something that I wasn't comfortable with, but that's because I was quite senior and I'd been there a long time and I sort of knew how to get out of it. But, they definitely asked people to write things according to, what Chris Mitchell thought,
What do you think? Why do you think there was that change in the noughties?
I think Chris Mitchell had a pretty big impact on the paper. I mean, he'd been there a long time, but he was editor-in-chief, and then it took a few years for him to kind of start putting all his people into place and, to start running his agenda. Before that, it was a lot kind of less sort of focused on a Murdoch agenda. I don't know what it is. These things are very hard to pin down. But, for example, they put in an editor of the media section that, was more focused on doing what the bosses wanted than actually listening to what the journalists wanted to write about. And probably the pressure on the paper losing money, making people redundant. When I left, there'd already been waves and waves of redundancies. The newsroom was getting smaller and smaller. They just introduced a paywall. There's so many pressures on the Oz. Would it survive? Yeah.
And so it came out, smaller and meaner. I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned this idea of the Murdoch agenda. One of the things that you hear often is that Rupert Murdoch himself is not personally involved in editorial. He's not, underlining things in the day's paper in the Oz and sending it back. But how does he, and how, I guess, maybe not he, but how does this then Murdoch agenda, I guess, exist in News Corp? How are people who are writing the articles, how do editors who are commissioning stuff, how do they kind of get that sense to then, I guess, carry out what the agenda is?
Yeah. Well, the culture within the newsroom, comes from above, I guess, and they appoint editors and section editors who they know will, play the game and do what's right. They never admit anything, of course, but they just, they just know what to do. And then the journalists underneath them also know, what to do and what not to say, and how to, deliver what is required. I guess it's self-censorship, isn't it?
Yeah, and self-selection as well, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, I've seen a lot of great I've seen a lot of great journalists who I think are doing good work, be at News Corp, and then I've also seen a lot of them then decide to leave. And these wouldn't be people I know personally, so I can't speak necessarily to exactly why they left, but it does kind of seem like, if there are people who I don't see necessarily who are working there but I don't think love playing the game, they often are looking for a place to go somewhere else and just do it without
Yes.
having to worry about that, right?
Yes. Look, there are people who completely believe in everything that News Corp stands for, love working there. They've drunk the Kool-Aid, and they're very comfortable within there. And then there's a whole lot of other people who just want a job, and they're happy to have a job, and they're happy in that job, because the Australian was, a quality paper with good resources and, look, nice people, really. But there comes a time, like I get quite judgy now of people that join now, like I don't blame you if you're there, but if you join now knowing what it's like, that's a hard one. Except I do agree. I know you guys talked about cadets joining News Corp. Absolutely. I think it's fantastic. If you get a cadetship at News Corp, you should take it. We actually just hired the Australians cadet for The Guardian.
Yeah, I did see that, actually.
Yeah. And we actually love hiring people from News Corp because they've generally had a really good training. And they've been everywhere, and they've been in a tough environment, and they're used to having to deliver, and they've been to courts and they've been to police and all of that. Whereas, if you were to start at The Guardian, you wouldn't get that kind of breadth of experience in Australia, because we just don't have, the infrastructure.
Totally.
Yeah. But what I've noticed actually, Cam, is that there are journalists who leave News Corp and then suddenly turn into these full-on lefties on Twitter. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know you were like that before. And they're attacking the government, and they're just calling things out all the time. I think, wow, that's really interesting, because when you're there, obviously you can't say anything.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I don't want you to dob in anyone who you might work with as sources, but I guess when you are working with people from News Corp and the way you get information, are these often people who are people who are not true believers, and so they're kind of, almost like being a source is their way of, I guess, having some kind of external accountability? Or is that one of the main motivations?
Absolutely. And look, to be honest, most of my mates have left. The sources are thin on the ground now because everybody just keeps leaving, right? So it gets harder and harder. But yeah, although, there's a really different culture between, say, the ABC and the Herald and the Australian. Like, the Guardian editors always ask me, but what are they saying on the floor, at the Australian? Surely in the newsroom they're complaining about this latest outrage. And I'm like, no, they don't. Nobody sort of, gets together and complains and says we're going to go to the editor and say we hate this story. There just isn't a culture of that. Whereas, at the old Fairfax or the ABC, the staff are kind of bolshy, and they're complaining loudly about the journalism.
As a former ABC, I can attest to that.
Yeah. It just doesn't happen. people don't really speak out against it. I can't remember, ever standing around, chewing the fat about the Murdoch agenda or anything, and then you just don't. Nobody talks about it.
Yeah. We've spoken on the podcast recently about how we're already seeing a kind of how like the Australian and other parts of News Corp are already kind of putting out some stuff in the lead up to the election, stuff that was quite critical, I think, of Anthony Albanese, that I think that, observers thought were not necessarily like not stuff they would have necessarily put on the front page themselves or even deserving as news of much coverage. So that was like, this stuff about China, the years old story about wealth that was like, from 3 decades ago. What do you expect to see from them this election?
Well, I think what we've seen in the last week or so, from Sharry Markson with her 30-year-old exclusive, and also that dodgy story about Anthony Albanese, speaking Chinese 3 years ago, it doesn't bode well. Are they going to, hook up with the coalition's dirt units and just pump out these stories that aren't even stories? It's quite worrying. I think it is going to be a dirty campaign. If it's ever not dirty, I'm not sure.
Can I try to drill down on that? Because I'm curious, because I also thought about a couple of weeks ago before, and the things that we mentioned were, I think, 2 things from Sharry Markson and also something from Sam Maiden, who were, big figures themselves. But we'd also seen, I thought, a few things that were unusually critical of Scott Morrison as well. There was Andrew Bolt. There's a few things that kind of, escape me right now, but also stuff that it felt like they were also then, laying the groundwork to not necessarily just be full-on boosters of ScoMo. So we're seeing both of that. What do you think that tells us about like how the way that the company uses its editorial strengths? Do you think that kind of illustrates the fact that there is not just this one single top-down message?
Yeah, it does. And they will point to that when they're saying we are diverse. They'll say, we publish, God, I don't know, who's not right-wing, Susie O'Brien or whatever in Queensland, and, Andrew Bolt. And Andrew Bolt often takes a counter view, if you think about it, during the environmental campaign, where suddenly they were greenies and they were aiming for net zero, which was across the company. Bolt complained about it openly. So there are some figures that are sort of above everyone, like Andrew Bolt. He can pretty much say whatever he wants. Having said that, I think Alan Jones went too far and ended up losing his job at Foxtel because they couldn't sort of control him. He went too crazy on the coronavirus stuff. But yeah, there isn't, one view for sure. These things are a lot more nuanced, a lot subtler than that. I don't think anyone has said, okay, we need to, save the coalition. So we need to, every story should be like that. I mean, I think if good journalists, Samantha Maiden is a very good journalist, and she comes up with a story that's negative for the coalition, then they're not going to spike it. They're going to run it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, finally, Amanda, I don't want to keep you any longer, but we did talk about this at the start with the Academy. If you were someone who was working for News Corp today, would you take this course? And would you take it because, you would think that you'd be learning a lot, or because you think that it's probably also the thing to do to kind of play the game of the company?
Look, I would probably do it. Why not?
Yeah,
Learn some new skills. I mean, Hedley Thomas could help me work out a podcast that could, win me the Gold Walkley.
Yep.
I'd be quite happy with that. I could talk to Sharry about how to go undercover at the university.
I was wondering if she's going to get a dose of her own treatment and someone's going to do that to her course.
Yes, to her course. I know. Oh, it's look, I would probably do it, but I mean, it's just fascinating. There's so many elements to this. There's going to be 750 reporters they're going to put through this course. I mean, that's a lot. Maybe they're going to take over the world.
Well, look, considering everything they own in Australia, they've already got a lot going on here. Amanda Meade, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Cam.
So that was our conversation with Amanda Meade. I completely disappeared through that, Cam, and I left you entirely alone. I'm sorry. My internet connection dropped out, and then my mic stopped working. It was a cavalcade of errors, and so thank you so much for carrying that.
No worries. We were actually communicating over a Google Doc, so
Yes.
you were really there, not only in spirit, but kind of through cyberspace as well. So thank you so much for listening to the podcast. As always, if you haven't already subscribed, if you've just ended up here by accident somehow, you can find us everywhere: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, next to Joe Rogan, I'm sure, or just about on most podcast platforms. And of course, please join our podcast group on Facebook at Murdocracy Podcast. Thanks to Kevin MacLeod for the theme music, the ABC for the recordings from the archive, Ruby Innes for our artwork, and as always, thanks to you, Sami.
And thank you very much, Cam. Bye.
Bye.